They're not waiting for the president to issue an edict or the UN Secretary General to put out a red carpet. All of us are in a field of consciousness and an ocean of conscious light. I can assure you that there are civilizations on this planet that predate our knowledge of Homo sapiens. By joining together in a 1% effect, the other 99% of humans will become more coherent, less violent, and that will potentiate these technologies to come out and be used to save the biosphere. We have more in common with those beings than we have difference. We are more alike than we are dissimilar. I like telling personal stories because it makes it real and less abstract. My dad, he smoked probably 3 packs a day for, Lord, 50 years. And I was living in the Middle East, and I got a call and said, your dad's got terminal lung cancer. And he had a very large golf ball size tumor in his right mainstem hilum, the center part of the chest that was inoperable. And back then, this was 78, 79, there weren't great chemotherapeutic or other treatments. And my father was a World War II veteran, had really serious PTSD, we came to realize, but he knew I had become a meditation teacher. And this is before I was a medical doctor. And so I went home to see him. I was told to come home to sort of basically pick out the coffin and make arrangements for him to be buried, because they said he only had a few weeks to live. And so I came back and I said, Dad, do you want to die of this? He said, no, I don't. And I said, well, I will teach you meditation. And then we will, even though I have to go back to the Middle East, we'll do this together. And so I taught him this mantra meditation that's in the CE5 Contact app. It's a simple mantra meditation approach. And I also taught him some visualization. And he was a very highly intelligent man, although he never got to go to college or anything. He sold fencing at a Sears store and stuff. I think the most he ever made in a week was $160 or something. But he was very, very bright. So I said, look, you have to just understand these simple things and we'll do it. So I went back to Israel. I would do these meditations with him and also some prayer and ask for healing. He would do the meditations and go into deep, quiet mind and see the tumor dissolving. A few weeks later, he goes to his physician and they do x-ray and it's gone. I mean, with no other it just totally vanished. He eventually died of emphysema and all that from smoking so much, but he didn't die of that damn cancer, and he didn't want to, and he didn't. So I'm not telling people not to get medical treatments. I'm just saying you can augment them greatly with consciousness. And what I learned at that age, I was maybe 22 or 23, is that really even someone like my dad, who had a really damaged childhood, had PTSD, was in hand-to-hand combat on an amphibious unit in the Pacific during World War II, that when he wanted to, he could sit down, learn to do this meditation, and when it was something he felt was important, it worked. Now, why do I tell that story tonight? It's because the state of the world right now is like the whole planet has terminal damn cancer. So we have to figure out, how do we collectively come together with the knowledge of the science of consciousness, the fact that the conscious mind is always operating without limit to location, to space or time, and that if we empower it, we can be, let's say, a vehicle or a clear channel for that force of good in the world by coming together. And the studies have all shown, whether it's Dr. Dossi, who wrote Recovering the Soul, a great book about prayer and meditation and healing, that when people do this, and there are more than a group does it, it has an exponential increase in effect. They found the same thing with the random number generators at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab. Dr. John had that, and he's passed away, but I knew him, and He loved what we were doing. He felt what we were doing in the world was a applied version of what he was doing in the laboratory at Princeton. And they found that if like two people loved each other and were unified, harmonic, and they put their attention on those random number generators, the effect wasn't 1 + 1 is 2. It was tenfold. It was an order of magnitude. So this is where we get into this discussion of what has been called the 1% effect that you see in this documentary, this 2-hour film, which obviously passes through a lot of information very quickly. You need to look at it 4 or 5 times probably. But what you find is that when they've done studies with meditators and they send them into a place and there's 1% of the population that are there meditating, even though the other 99% know they're in the city at all, they don't even know. They find that there's amazing changes that happen in terms of violent crime rates, emergency room visits, all kinds of negative social and personal behavior just begins to go down. Why is that? It's because all of us are in a field of consciousness and an ocean of conscious light. And when enough people go into that deep state and then intend good, it has an effect on everyone. It doesn't matter if you're talking to them like this or not. It has a salutary, beneficial, and positive effect. Now let's imagine millions of people doing this in mass meditations, not only for humanity and the earth, but for our relationship with these interstellar civilizations that are waiting for us to awaken to this possibility. That's what they're waiting for. They're not waiting for the president to issue an edict or the UN Secretary General to put out a red carpet or some state house or government. They're waiting for this. This is what they've been waiting for since we started the modern era of weapons of mass destruction and nuclear bombs. And these interstellar civilizations appeared all over the world en masse back in the 40s, 50s, 60s. They're waiting for humans to awaken to a path of healing, a path of enlightenment, and awakening to a new civilization, rather than a path of just endless war, endless destruction, endless egotistical focus. Because the opposite of egotistical behavior is this ability to connect to something greater than your own individuality. But realize your individuality, when it's connected to this larger conscious field that's universal, can be a force for enormous good. It's a paradox. On the one hand, it's that pre-existent field of consciousness is always there, but the activation of it and the change that can happen on a planet like ours or in the cosmos happens when people awaken to that. And that's part of the paradox and mystery of existence. So that's what these civilizations are waiting for. They're not waiting for a political solution the way we normally think of it. They're looking for a political social movement, let's call it, but that is rooted in understanding the science of consciousness, because they understand that that would be the indication that a civilization like ours, which is an incipient, young, rather atavistic. I mean, you think about so many things we keep sliding back to. Atavistic means the return to a primitive state, a rather primitive and not in a good way state, not in a childlike pure state, but in a sort of a savage, violent state. And we just need to evolve to where we're connecting to this conscious field and understanding that we all can do this together. You do not have to be an enlightened avatar or a prophet or a yogi or whatever. In fact, I think that whole system has become a crutch where we just sort of cop out of our own responsibility and look to some leader, whether it be a new age one or a religious one or some person who's some self-anointed high priest or whatever. And that just takes our own power away. We need to say, no, we each one of us have this ability. And if there are enlightened people who can help share and teach other people, that's a very good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's when we see that there are people who have that ability that we turn to and then view ourselves as non-participatory, as sort of passive sheeple that just let that happen without activating our own inherent natural abilities. So the science of consciousness is really an ancient study. It goes back since the dawn of higher intelligent life forms on this planet and elsewhere. And I can assure you that there are civilizations on this planet that predate our knowledge of Homo sapiens, that were very high tech, that existed millions of years ago, tens of millions of years ago. And that we're at a phase now where in this, let's call it cycle of evolution, that we have to go from this age of reductionism and separation and us versus them thinking to an age of where I say it's the unitive state. It's the state where we're connecting to an aspect of all things and all people and all creatures throughout the cosmos through the field of consciousness. And why is that? There's a very practical reason for it. I can tell you, having led thousands of people around the world making contact, and some of those events you've seen in this Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind documentary, people can get pretty freaked out. Not because there's any harm being done, because it's something not normal for them. The people who understand deeply that these civilizations and those people, I call them, that are non-human, but I call them people, the ones who get that most clearly and see that those are just different variants, let's say, of us. That's why the motto for our organization is one universe, one people. In reality, there's one conscious being phasing and resonating through all of us. So when you connect to that level of consciousness, I always say, this is why I never use the A word. It's like the N word or the K word or the F word. The alien word is inherently xenophobic and racist. There's nothing alien about them, except unless you're connecting to only your Homo sapienness. What do I mean by that? The fact that you are of one species, Homo sapiens, humans, to the exclusion that anyone else is an alien. Well, why are they alien? They're alien because we're not connecting to the deeper spiritual truth of the fact that we are conscious and awake and sentient. But when you look into the eyes of these ET beings, they're conscious and awake and sentient. Therefore, if we're connecting at that level, which is a very simple level, like I said, it's closer to us than our lifespan, it's right there. If we connect to that level, we'll be grounded in where we have commonality and oneness instead of alienness and foreignness and fear, which then leads to interstellar racism, which is what's going on mostly in the UFO subculture. You'll notice, by the way, that the good aliens are always ones that kind of look like they came from Northern Europe. And the bad ones are ones that are different color or height or shape. This is just us projecting our own crap, excuse my language, our own baggage of thousands of years of racism and bigotry and inhumanity to each other onto this situation. And we've got to go beyond that. We must transcend that dynamic, not only with each other, so that we can get beyond all the isms, racism, homophobia, sexism, misogyny, whatever it is. But we have to do that in a way where, for it to last, it can't just be an intellectualization. It's actually a deep spiritual awakening where we realize, this is the heart of compassion of the Buddha, by the way, where we realize we are all one being, that the conscious being within us and the light of consciousness within another human or another ET or another civilization from a galaxy very far away, that conscious field is a singularity. It's one. And by relating to that, rather than being overwhelmed by our differences, then we can stay in a grounded place where we're not going to be afraid. And I like this story in the Bhagavad Gita where Krishna is talking to Arjuna on the battlefield, and he said, a little of this and it's this with a capital T, which is referring to pure conscious, the pure field of consciousness, eliminates all fear. Why? Because if you're grounded in that field of consciousness through meditation and understanding, there's nothing to be afraid of. You're really at a place where you can go, I'm sort of have an eternal, infinite, universal aspect of myself that is in perfect harmony and oneness with every other being. And that also makes you realize that your lifespan on this planet at this particular life is also not the end or beginning of things for you. It goes on forever. I mean, I guess lucky in my case, when I was a young, rambunctious, and rather rebellious and athletic teenager at age 17, I died. People say, oh, how lucky for you. Well, I was very sick, and I did a 30-mile mountain bike ride today, but I was 17, and I decided in my infinite wisdom to bicycle from Charlotte, North Carolina, all the way to the coast of North Carolina, 200 miles in one day. But I had injured my left leg, and that bike ride spread an infection in that injury all through my leg. But I said, I tend to be very stoic. I have a rather high pain tolerance. And I said, I'll just deal with it. And I bicycled 200 miles back. Well, of course, that led to a catastrophe where, as a doctor now, I realized I had hepatorenal syndrome and sepsis, where the infection went all through my body, shut down my kidneys, shut down my liver, and I died. So I'm 17 years old, living in an apartment. I lied about my age, said I was 20. But I'm still working in high school, washing dishes at a Red Lobster, actually pots and pans, for $1.80 an hour. And I was sort of like, not in great shape. And we did, in America, those of you listening from other parts of the world, we don't have a healthcare system here. We have a health profit system here. I say that as an emergency doctor on the front lines. And so I was too poor to have a doctor. I grew up so poor, we almost never saw one. And I just said, so I went to bed and I died. And I had this amazing experience, which is too long to go into here, I guess. But what it did, the core of what it taught me, even though I was raised a very devout atheist, it taught me that, in fact, our inner conscious spirit is infinite, eternal, and that as I went out into space, I didn't go to some pearly gates. I was always in love with space and the stars and the sky and nature. So I went out into space, and I went into, it was called Brahman consciousness. But I went into a state where my consciousness, the little drop that I thought was my own consciousness, expanded. It became the cosmic awareness. But then I also became aware that consciousness was everything that existed in creation, from the celestial to the material, where I literally experienced the planet and the stars and space and time and the astral worlds of light, all as sort of the expression, an outer garment of this infinite self, this infinite being. It was breathtaking and beautiful. But, I didn't really, I experienced it and understood it on the experiential level, but I didn't have any knowledge. I didn't know anything about any of this. But I began to study this. And this is why on my 18th birthday, I learned Sanskrit mantra meditation, and then became a meditation teacher. So that's why I did all of that before I became a medical doctor. But what it taught me was that this is what everyone is. It wasn't that I was special at all. I'm not in the least. It's that every single being who can become aware of consciousness itself has that folded within them. It's like beautiful saying, this is another old Persian, thinkest thyself a puny form when within thee the universe is folded. In other words, you think you're a small thing when in reality, the totality of the entire cosmos and creation is folded like a conscious quantum hologram inside you and me and everybody. So that knowledge and realization was not academic, because, fool that I was, I just wouldn't listen to my body and just pushed and pushed and pushed myself. I'm still a little bit that way, aren't I? But my son-in-law's going, "What are you doing at your age, doing all this stuff?" I go, "Oh, well, I mean, I'll rest when I drop dead again or something." That's my saying. But I think that we have to understand that this is what all of us are. I mean, whether it's a homeless person on the street or someone that you rever like the Dalai Lama, we all have that within us. And so understanding that is so beautiful. And once we understand it and own it, then that's going to inform what we're going to do. We're going to aspire to connect to that aspect. And when we do, then we're going to be an ambassador to the universe. Because then we're going to understand that these other civilizations that are beyond the speed of light and their capabilities understand all of this in their own way. And we understand it, but we can relate to it in a very simple form. And that is by going into deep conscious meditation. And initially, when you're meditating, what happens is that you just sense some quiet calmness of mind. But as you do it enough, day after day, every day, 2-3 times a day, before you go to sleep, as sort of a simple discipline, it doesn't take long, 20-30 minutes. What you find is that you literally become conscious of that field of awareness when you're awake. You start having more and more lucid dreams, and you're awake doing your normal routine stuff. And your intuitive light, your sensing of things that the 5 senses of your body kick in. This is really important when you're out in the stars doing this, because you're not really there to see a machine fly over. And if you are, you're there for the wrong reason. You're there to connect to the occupants of those things called UFOs or ET craft. I mean, this is the whole problem with ufology. It's very materialistic. Who cares about the machinery? It's like if a head of state drives up to your house in a Mercedes, you're going to ignore the world leader and be fawning over the car? Well, some of us will, because I love vehicles. I'm like a boy that way. But no, not really. You're going to pay attention to what's the occupant of the vehicle. So in this case, the quote UFOs are just mechanisms for transport through space-time. But let's ask the question, who's on board? Who is that? And how are they different from us, but how are they like us? And if you understand the depth and richness of consciousness, we have more in common with those beings than we have difference. We are more alike than we are dissimilar. And also, even as humans, the more we realize this, the more we're going to transcend racism and religiosity and ethnic conflict and religious conflict, because the truth is, however you feel and treat the least amongst us, is you're really doing that to yourself. Because you have this infinite aspect of yourself in it. And when you understand that, that's how you really can develop genuine kindness or kindliness. That's a way to function. And we all try to aspire to that, all imperfectly, of course, in our day-to-day lives. But having these experiences in deep consciousness and field consciousness that are deeply spiritual, it enables us not only to be like that with people, but also with these interstellar visitors. We're not locked into this idea that, oh my God, there's a weird looking alien that's 3 feet tall or 12 inches tall or 12 feet tall. Like we have some that are very huge that come around us. No, you realize that those are beings that are conscious and intelligent, and the awareness within them, even though they experience the universe in their own way as an individual or as a society, and we experience it in our own way, that the light of consciousness, the singularity of the consciousness field, is a singularity. And that's why it's so brilliant when Erwin Schrödinger, who's the father of modern quantum physics and particle wave theory, and I believe in 1908 said, The total number of minds in the universe is one. It's a singularity. Now we divide it up into our individualities and thinking we're all separate. But the science has proven that we're not all separate at all. We're always interwoven in this fabric of conscious awareness. And the more we meditate, the more we have that not as an intellectualization up here, but as a genuine experience that gives rise to knowledge, and that gives rise to wisdom. And many people will say, how can Dr. Greer say that these aliens aren't harmful to us? I'm going, well, you cannot prove a negative, but if they are, shouldn't we have a bunch of ambassadors that are enlightened on this planet to make contact with them and create a rapprochement? I mean, you're going to resolve a problem like that with people who have the ability to go beyond the speed of light with a nuclear weapon or an electronic weapon? No, I mean, that'd be the termination of both planets instantly. Therefore, no matter what your belief is, given the cacophony of opinions out there on this, the path of wisdom is that we become ambassadors to the universe first by understanding the universal aspect of ourselves, and then going out and making contact with these civilizations while we're established in that state of consciousness, because then there are no aliens. There are only fellow intelligent beings. And on that basis, you can go beyond the prejudices that kick in. We all have prejudices. We're all raised with prejudices. We all have them, but you can go beyond them so that on the things that are really important, and we are in an interplanetary moment that's been forestalled for decades, that we begin to come together and do the right thing and become ambassadors of enlightenment from humanity to these civilizations. And that's urgent. That's why I use the analogy about my father having cancer. Our whole civilization has had a metastasizing illness of separation and violence and otherness and racism and ethnic conflict and all of these sort of things that have brought us to the state we're in now. And the only way that's going to be solved, the external solutions will unfold when we understand that deep within we have to attain the solution of consciousness and enlightenment. Because think about it for a moment. Let's say that, of course, these have existed for 100 years. You have a so-called free energy device, and it's a zero-point energy device. That energy device is tapping into an infinite energy field, as Nikola Tesla called it. And those systems, yes, they can run your house and they can run your car and aircraft that have no pollution, but they can be weaponized. So how do you go beyond our proclivity, this sort of illness that humans have, to take every technological development and use it first for war? Unfortunately, classified projects have done precisely that. They have taken technologies that have been evolved from the early 20th century that were then greatly potentiated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s by studying interstellar vehicles. And they have weaponized them, and they are out on satellites in space. They're on the ground, they're under the ocean, and they're on aircraft, and they have been used against these interstellar visitors. So what I tell people is that right now we have the worst of all worlds, because the least conscious people have the most powerful technologies. What we have to do is develop at least this 1% effect, where 1% of our population connecting to this unitive state of consciousness can wisely create a movement so that we can not only make contact with these civilizations peacefully, but by joining together in a 1% effect, the other 99% of humans will become more coherent, less violent, and that will potentiate these technologies to come out and be used to save the biosphere. And so a lot of people want to think of this sequentially. We need this, and then I said, no. Sequentially could have happened in 1908, maybe 1945. In 2020, my friends, it's got to all come together like hitting the perfect score. And we're just out of time to do this in a linear and sequential way. You extrapolate where we are now, if we don't fix this problem in the next 10 to 30 years, it's just going to be all over but the shouting. So this is an urgent situation. I always joke, I'm an emergency doctor, so maybe I see the world that way, but I think we're in a genuine global emergency. More and more people are awakening to that. What they're not awakening to is a wise way of having the solution. So we have to have conscious people coming together to create a peaceful planet that is not only a planetary society, but an interplanetary one, so that these technologies can be applied in a way that is beneficial to all life and doesn't create another horrific weapon system. So this is it's at once a material problem and a scientific problem and a deeply spiritual crisis, all rolled into one. The reverse is also true, however, on a hopeful note. Once a society opens its eyes to that reality, what happens is that technologies just begin to be potentiated without restriction, suppression, secrecy, that can do amazing things, but without any violent application. So the root of this is creating a civilization where we can advance technologically in parallel with, not in exclusion to, our deep conscious spiritual evolution. And those two things coming together is what's going to give us, as the ET said, the Colonel Corso, a new world if you can take it. I love that story. There's more to it than we relate in the movie. And but I think it's beautiful to realize that that's what we have the potential for, and that destiny is in our hands. It's not in the hands of some elite cabal. We like to go on and on about them, but in reality, they're just not that powerful compared to 8 billion people in the world waking up to their own reality. They would be like a gnat flying into the sun, which is, by the way, when I got threatened by the head of Army intelligence and death threats and people on my team murdered, and I got a malignant melanoma and metastatic cancer that almost took me out, that was quite artificially induced. That, back then, before I had good protection, which I have now, frankly, it was very dangerous, but I was never afraid. I think my family and children were. I wasn't afraid because, I told the head of Army intelligence, I've seen what's beyond the 3D cosmos, and whatever your little plan is, there's another plan, and I can tell you which one's going to prevail. It isn't yours. I said that right to his face in 1992, in April of 1992. He was not happy because, if anyone who gets to know me knows I don't suffer fools well and tend to be very direct. I wasn't violent. I just said, look, you're not going to intimidate us with this nonsense, and you can't deceive us. So we have to be wise enough and become what are called the Shambhala warriors, that tradition of the Shambhala kingdom, where they weren't warriors of violence, they were warriors in consciousness, where they, as Arjuna was told by Krishna, they have gone beyond fear. They've gone beyond multiplicity into this state of oneness. And therefore, in your own personal life, you can take on any effort, you can cross any chasm, and you can do it without the normal insecurity and fear that you have, which is natural if you just stay in your own head, on your own space, thinking that all that exists is your physical body and this little chunk of time, maybe 100 years that you're on this planet. So it is really a spiritual crisis and a crisis in consciousness. And as we understand consciousness in its deepest aspect, we begin to understand what the future holds in terms of a profound and deep spirituality, but that transcends the claptrap of let's call it religiosity, that ends up destroying spirituality. I think we have to understand that at the core of many spiritual traditions were really beautiful, inspired ideas. But of course, then men got hold of it and destroyed them, didn't they? So I think the only way we're going to solve that problem also is that we understand that we're all have to be, in a sense, yogis or priests. We all have to be conscious and enlightenment. It isn't enough to bend a pious knee once a week at a church or a temple. We have to understand that within our, and that may, if that is something helpful for you, that's great. But we have to understand that that's just to remind us of what we need to be all the time, every day, all the time. And it has amazing applications. I mean, as an emergency doctor, I tell some really kind of funny stories. I don't know if you want to hear these on a Saturday night, but they're sort of beautiful. Like, I had this boy that came in, a young man, he was like 26, and he had 2 kids, and it was, since this is coronavirus, he had, it was flu season, and everyone thought he had a really bad case of the flu. So he's put into he wasn't in a trauma room, he was in a regular medical room. I go in and see him, and I would never be able to say this if I was still in a hospital right now, because I'd be crucified as a sort of a charlatan, or worse, have my medical license taken away, I guess. But I looked at him, and you know how dogs just sort of sense things? They can sense. I'm kind of like a big dog that way. So I could just sense, I could feel that he had this big brain tumor. And I also sensed that all of his symptoms, every one of them, was due to this big brain tumor. So I turned to the nurse and I said, I need an emergency CAT scan, CT of the head. And she was fantastic. Saw the Earth, North Carolina. She says, well, Dr. Greer, he's only got the flu. And I went, just do it. It was, luckily I didn't have to go through a bunch of Nazis in HMO or insurance or government. So we got the CAT scan, and sure enough, there was this big brain tumor, but it was a type of astrocytoma. It was a type of brain tumor that was like a pancake on the top up here, and it was squeezing his brain. It reached a critical size where it was pushing his brainstem, where you have the areas that control for vomiting, breathing, temperature regulation, was all being affected. So he had all these symptoms that were exactly like the flu, no other neurological symptoms, and all of them were from this hidden brain tumor. Now, when I handed this off to the neurosurgeon, he said to me, he says, why did you order a CAT scan on this patient? I never would have. I said, I couldn't tell him what I'm telling you. It's someday, hopefully in medical school, we can teach our doctors this. I said, well, I just had a hunch. But in reality, I saw and felt this brain tumor. So it saved that boy's life. And, whether you're an airline pilot or a computer programmer or a CEO or a nurse or a doctor, whatever you do, or you're a truck driver and you need to anticipate something up over the horizon that you can't see with your eyeball, being awake in this field of consciousness is incredibly beautiful and important, and it can be life and death. So I think we have to accept that this is the wonder of our time, is that we can merge science and technology with the experience of consciousness in its deepest aspect and become truly awake. Well, with that, I'm going to let a couple of questions come in. I know I've gone on a bit long, but I wanted to just give an overview of this. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Michael, do you have a question from the folks?
Absolutely, Dr. Greer. Great show tonight. First question is the CE5 movement being opposed by religious fundamentalists inside of the U.S. government?
Everything enlightened is opposed by fundamentalists, whether they're in the government or elsewhere. And I mean that in the sense that there is a big problem with people who are steeped in sectarian fanaticism, let's call them. I call them the American Taliban. And they exist, and they've risen through the ranks of the FBI and CIA and government. I know a number of them. And they have the most their ideas are so untutored it beggars the imagination. One of the shocks I had as I started into this with the Disclosure Project, which was an outgrowth of the CE5 contacts we had in the early 90s, is that there were really powerful people who had ideas that were so bizarre, but they had enormous power. So yes, they're going to be opposed to anything that doesn't build into their eschatological fantasy. But eschatology is the study of how the world's going to end. It's sort of the Armageddonites who, are like the prince Hans Adam von Liechtenstein, who said, we really want people to hate the aliens. That's why I'm funding all the abduction squads and abduction researchers, so that people will hate the aliens enough to go to interplanetary war.
If you enjoyed this video, make sure to check out the next one right here on the Best of Dr. Stephen Greer.